I had always wanted to visit Boston because the city's history fascinated me, and I had heard so much about its old streets, its colonial buildings, and its mysterious legends. So when I decided to come here, I knew it wasn't just a trip for sightseeing. I was on a mission to learn about my family's past. My great-grandfather had lived here, and there were stories about him that had never been told. Maybe I would uncover something important or even write a book about it one day. It was a chilly evening when I arrived, and thick fog covered the streets. I could barely see a few feet ahead, and the street lamps cast strange, glowing circles on the ground. Boston felt different than I had imagined because the fog seemed to carry secrets, as if the city was hiding something from me. I arrived at the townhouse where I would be staying. The building looked old but sturdy, with tall windows and dark wood. But I felt like there was something about it that felt off, like it had a life of its own. The owner of the house, an older man with a sharp gaze, greeted me at the door. His smile was polite, but something was unsettling in the way he looked at me, like he was studying me more than welcoming me. As I stepped inside, I noticed strange things. The hallway lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move. The air smelled old, like a mix of dust, but I told myself it was just the age of the house, and I brushed off the feeling of unease because I needed to focus on my research and my plans for the next few days. Then, I made my way up the stairs to my room. The house creaked under my feet, and I could hear the soft hum of the wind outside. The room was small, with antique furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There was a window that looked out onto the street, but the fog made it hard to see anything clearly. As I unpacked, I noticed something strange. A door at the end of the hallway near my room. It was closed, and there was no handle, and it was just an old-fashioned lock. But it seemed odd because there was no reason for a door to be there. The house was old, but why would they lock a door that didn't even seem to lead anywhere? Then, I shook my head and thought it was just a part of the house's history, maybe some old storage room or utility space. But then, I felt a strange sense of being watched, like someone, or something, was standing just behind me and it was waiting. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling stayed with me, and I couldn't shake it. That night, as I lay in bed and tried to sleep, suddenly I heard something. Faint footsteps in the hallway, slow and careful, as if someone was walking past my door. I sat up quickly and my heart was racing because it was late, too late for anyone to be up. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe it was the fog playing tricks on my mind. But sleep didn't come easily because the feeling of being watched lingered. For a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake by choosing this place. But I pushed the thought aside because tomorrow I would focus on my research, and everything would make sense. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The next morning I woke up early, but I still felt the lingering unease from the night before. I tried to shake off the strange feeling that clung to me like the fog outside, but it was hard. The townhouse, with its old wood floors and creaking walls, felt both familiar and unsettling. I reminded myself that I was here to uncover my family's history, not get caught up in strange feelings. After breakfast, I decided to explore the house more thoroughly. As I walked down the hallway, my eyes went straight to the door at the end of the hall, the locked door. I hadn't thought much about it last night, but now that I had more time, it looked even stranger in the daylight, and I felt like it was just out of place. I stood in front of it for a moment and wondered what was behind it. Maybe it was just an old storage room. But then again, why would anyone lock a door that no one would ever use? The more I thought about it, the more I felt like it was hiding something, maybe something important. Later, I turned away and decided to go downstairs to check out the library, where I hoped to find more information about my family's history. But as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, because the house seemed too quiet and too silent. And then, I heard it. Whispers, faint but clear, coming from the direction of the locked door. Suddenly, my heart skipped a beat. I froze, and my breath was catching in my chest. I told myself it was just the house making sounds because old houses often did that. But the whispers sounded too. It was deliberate and as if someone was speaking, just on the other side of the door. Then, I quickly turned and hurried down the stairs, trying to push the thought out of my head. When I entered the library, the quietness and dustiness of the room helped calm my nerves. I spent hours reading, but that strange and uneasy feeling never completely left me. That night, as I lay in bed again, I heard it. Footsteps, but this time they were closer. Much closer, and they were coming down the hallway toward my room. My heart raced, and I held my breath. Was someone in the house? I waited in silence, but there was nothing because the footsteps stopped just outside my door. Later, I got up slowly and opened the door. The hallway was empty. My pulse raced as I stepped into the hallway, but everything was quiet and silent. There was no one around, but it felt like something was right there, just out of sight. Then I looked down the hallway, at the locked door. For a moment, it seemed like the air around it was heavier, as if something inside the house was trying to pull me in. But I didn't go toward it, and then I quickly returned to my room, locked the door behind me, and pulled the covers over my head, trying to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I decided I needed answers because I couldn't ignore the strange happenings anymore. I went out into the town, hoping to find someone who might know more about the house. That's when I met Sarah. She was a local guide, friendly, and eager to share the stories of the city. After a few minutes of casual conversation, I decided to ask her about the townhouse. Suddenly, her face changed the moment I mentioned it, and I could tell that there was something she wasn't telling me. "Ah, the old house," she said slowly. "It has a history, you know. People have disappeared around there." Then I raised an eyebrow and I was unsure if I had heard her words. "Disappearances? What do you mean?" Sarah looked around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "It has been a long time, but the rumors still float around. People say that the house isn't just old, it is cursed. There are stories of people going in and never coming back. Strange things that happen inside that can't be explained." Suddenly, I frowned and I was not sure if I believed her, but Sarah seemed serious. "The house is linked to the past, things from another time. Some people say that the spirits of those who lived there never left, so I would be careful if I were you." I thanked Sarah and felt a mix of curiosity and fear. Could it be true? Was there really something dangerous about the townhouse? Didn't know, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me and waiting for me to find the truth. Later that day, I returned to the townhouse, but my mind was swirling with thoughts of Sarah's warning. When I entered my room, something caught my eye. The door at the end of the hall, the locked door, was slightly ajar. When I saw it, my heart skipped a beat, but I couldn't resist, and then I walked toward it slowly. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, and for a moment, I stood frozen in the doorway because the air inside the room was cold, and I could feel something watching me, and it was something dark. Then suddenly, a shadow moved across the room. It was quick, and it was like something, or someone, had just passed by. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped back, but before I could react, the shadow was gone. Then I slammed the door shut and my hands were trembling. I couldn't explain what had just happened. Was it my imagination? Or was there something truly wrong with the house? I didn't know, but I was more certain than ever that I needed to find out what was behind that door because the danger was real, and it was waiting for me. I couldn't stop thinking about the locked door because something about it called to me like it was hiding something important. After hearing Sarah's warning and the strange things happening around the house, I knew I had to find out what was behind it. That evening, after dinner, I couldn't resist any longer. I had to know what was in that room. I approached the door again, which was still slightly ajar. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. For a moment I hesitated and wondered if I should go back. But curiosity got the best of me, and I pushed the door open slowly. Inside was a small and dusty room. It looked forgotten, like no one had stepped foot in it for years. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw an old wooden desk pushed against the wall. Then I saw an object that caught my attention, an old leather-bound diary. I walked over to the desk and carefully opened the diary. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the handwriting was clear. It belonged to a child, someone who had lived in this house long ago. The first page was filled with words about isolation, about being alone in the house, and about something terrifying that the child called the Watcher in the Walls. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the words. The child spoke of hearing whispers, of seeing shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, and of feeling watched all the time. The diary was filled with fear. The child was terrified, and I could feel it too. Suddenly I heard something, a soft and faint crying coming from somewhere behind me. My heart stopped and then I turned quickly, but there was no one there. I felt a cold breeze brush against my arm like a hand. But when I looked, no one was there. My breathing quickened, and I rushed to close the diary because my thoughts were racing. Was the child still here? Was there something in this room or in this house that I couldn't see? I had to leave, but the door behind me wouldn't open. For a moment, I thought I was trapped. Then the crying grew louder and it was more desperate. Then just as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. I could feel the air growing colder and my own breath was visible in the dark room. I grabbed the door handle again, and this time, it opened. I rushed out and slammed the door behind me, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. There was something dark in this house, and it was watching me. The next morning, I was still shaken from the events of last night because I couldn't stop thinking about the diary and about the crying. I needed to talk to someone, to understand what was going on in this house. So, I decided to visit the neighbor who lived next door. I knocked on the door, and a woman in her late 30s answered. Her name was Emily, and she seemed friendly even though she was a little nervous when I mentioned the townhouse. I have heard strange things about that place, she said, and her voice was lower now. I have lived next door for years, and I have seen things I can't explain. Then, Emily invited me in, and we sat down in her small living room. She told me about fleeting shadows moving across her apartment, about things that would disappear, and then reappear in different places. It's like something is playing tricks on us, she said and shook her head. I have never told anyone this, but I think the townhouse is haunted, she continued. The owner, there is something off about him. He has always been strange, but recently he has been even more secretive. I wouldn't trust him if I were you. I was stunned because I had already felt something strange about the townhouse owner, but now I wasn't so sure if it was just my imagination. Emily told me more about her experiences, objects moving on their own, windows that would open and close by themselves, and the feeling of being watched even when she was alone. Then Emily said quietly, "The worst part is when I hear things in the walls. It is like someone is walking inside them, but when I look, there is no one there. That's why I keep away from that place. It is not just the house, it is the things inside it. Don't stay there too long and it's not safe." Nodded, and I felt more uneasy than ever. I wasn't sure what was happening, but everything Emily said made me believe that the townhouse was not just old, it was cursed. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in the house was getting closer. I couldn't ignore the strange noises coming from the basement any longer. Emily's warning echoed in my mind, but I knew I had to explore, and if I was going to get to the bottom of all this, I had to face whatever was hiding in the house. Stairs to the basement creaked under my feet as I descended into the dark and cold space. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew made my nose wrinkle. I could hear something. Soft whispers, like voices coming from deep within the walls. But there was no one around. As I moved further into the basement, I noticed a collection of old boxes and crates. Some were covered with thick layers of dust, while others looked like they had been recently moved. I began to open one of the boxes, and inside I found something strange, a small and tarnished locket. Then I picked it up carefully. The locket was old and its surface was scratched and worn with age. But it wasn't just the locket that caught my attention. It was the engraving on the inside. It read, A.E. 1785. Suddenly, I remembered the initials matched those of the child from the diary. My heart raced because this locket must have belonged to the child. Suddenly, the basement. Lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. Then I froze because the air felt thick and suffocating. And then, I heard it. A soft breath, and it was right next to my ear. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't my imagination, because someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The darkness seemed to press in on me, and I couldn't move. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight, but before I could, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I didn't wait to find out who, or what, was behind me. I ran up the stairs, not looking back because my heart was pounding in my chest. Whatever was in that house was real, and it was getting closer. Now I couldn't ignore it anymore because the locked doors, the diary, and the strange happenings, all of it pointed to one thing. The townhouse owner knew something, so I had to confront him. I wasn't sure what, I would say, but I knew I couldn't leave without answers. Then I walked into the parlor, where the owner sat in his usual spot and was reading. The room felt heavier than before, like the air was thicker. I stood by the door for a moment, and I was unsure if I should speak. But then I took a deep breath and walked up to him. "I need to talk to you," I said, and my voice was steady but filled with urgency. "About the locked door and the diary. What's really going on here?" He looked up at me, and his eyes were narrowing, but his face remained calm. "I am afraid I don't understand," he said, and his tone was flat and distant. "There is nothing strange about this house." But I didn't believe him. "What about the diary? The child's diary with the mention of the watcher in the walls. What are you hiding?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood up slowly and walked across the room as if he was considering my question. "There is nothing you need to worry about," he said finally, and his voice was colder now. "Some things are better left undisturbed." I couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying. Before I could ask more questions, something strange happened. As he moved past me, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. It seemed to appear behind him, and it was like a dark figure. For a moment I froze and my heart skipped a beat. But when I blinked, the shadow was gone. I looked back at the owner, but he was still walking across the room as if nothing had happened. I couldn't stop shaking. Was I seeing things? Or had I really just seen a shadow? I wanted to ask him about it, but my mind was racing. If he was hiding something, and I wasn't sure if I could trust him anymore, I had to get out of that room, and fast. I turned and left without saying another word. As I walked down the hallway, I couldn't help but feel that something was watching me. It was something dark and unseen. Now I thought I needed help because the more I uncovered about the house, the more I realized I couldn't do this alone. I had to find someone who knew more about what was happening, someone who could help me make sense of the strange events. The next day, I went to Boston's historical archives because I hoped to find something or anything that could explain the mysterious past of the townhouse. After hours of searching through old records, I found a few documents that caught my attention. The documents said the townhouse had a dark history. It wasn't just an old building. It had been the site of a terrible tragedy many years ago. According to the records, a child had died there under mysterious circumstances. The child had lived in the house with their family, but one day, they were found dead. There were whispers of foul play, but the case was never solved. The first owner of the house was said to have been involved in some kind of cover-up, but no one knew the full truth. I left the archives feeling more confused than ever. What had really happened in that house? And why had it been kept a secret for so long? Later that evening, I met with a paranormal investigator and I told him everything. The locked doors, the diary, and the strange events. He listened carefully and nodded occasionally as I spoke. When I finished, he looked at me seriously. "The child's spirit may still be here," he said quietly. "If the death was covered up, but if justice was never served, the spirit may be seeking revenge, or it may simply be looking for justice." Suddenly I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. What did this mean for me? Was I in danger? Then the investigator gave me a warning. "You need to be careful," he said. "If the spirit is angry, it could become violent. But if you can help it find peace, maybe you can end this. But you must be prepared for what you might find." I didn't know if I was ready for that, but I had no choice. I had to see this through. The truth was out there, and I was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Later, we decided to investigate together because the investigator had agreed to help me. Now we stood at the base of the attic stairs where we hoped to find more clues, because we knew the child's belongings were somewhere in the house, and we believed the attic might hold the key to understanding what had really happened. The air in the attic was thick with dust, and the beams creaked under our weight as we climbed up. The dim light from the attic window barely reached the far corners of the room. As we moved through the space, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "There," the investigator said, and pointed to an old chest in the corner. It was covered in cobwebs and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Then, I approached it slowly, and I felt a sense of dread. What would we find inside? Then, I knelt down and opened the chest. Inside, there were old clothes, toys, and various objects. But what caught my eye was a small wooden box at the bottom. I opened it carefully, and inside there were several items. A faded photograph of a young child, a broken doll, and a small and worn book. The book was similar to the diary I had found earlier, but this one was different. It was smaller, and it was more delicate. As I flipped through the pages, I found something chilling. Drawings of the house, the locked doors, and the figure of a tall man watching over the child. But the most unsettling part was the final page. It simply read, "He won't let me leave." Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze brush past me and I looked up. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room and it was watching us. It was just a glimpse, but it was enough to make my heart race. Suddenly, the figure in the corner began to move. I felt frozen and I was unable to scream. Then, the figure stepped forward, and I realized it was a child, a pale and translucent figure. It wept silently and its face was twisted in sadness. The room grew colder, and the presence became overwhelming. I had to leave, and then I grabbed the book and backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. As I turned to leave, the child's voice whispered through the air, "Help me." I didn't know if I could help, but I knew one thing for sure. The spirit wasn't going to leave until it got the justice it had been denied. And now, I was involved in something much bigger than I had ever imagined. Now, I could no longer ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong in the townhouse. It wasn't just the locked doors or the strange occurrences. I felt like I was being led toward a terrible truth. I had to confront the owner again. But this time, I was determined to get answers. I found him in the parlor. As usual, he was sitting by the fire. But his expression was different today. Tired, worn, and almost defeated. When he saw me, he didn't even try to hide it. His eyes met mine, and for the first time he seemed hesitant. There was a heavy silence between us. "I know what you have been doing," I said, and my voice was firm. "I know about the diary, about the child, and about the curse." Suddenly, the owner's face drained of color, and I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't say anything for a moment, as if he was weighing whether to speak. Finally, he sighed deeply and set down his glass. "I suppose it is time you knew the truth," he began. "You see, I am the descendant of the original owner of this house, the man who covered up the child's death." Suddenly, my heart skipped a beat because the truth was even darker than I had imagined. "There is a curse in my family," he continued, and his voice was low. "The child's death was no accident, and the spirit that haunts this house isn't just angry, it's bound to us. My ancestors made a deal, and in exchange for their own safety, they trapped the spirit here." I felt a chill spread through me. "So, you have been keeping the child's spirit trapped all these years?" "Yes," he admitted and looked down. "I had no choice. If the spirit is freed, it will take revenge on my bloodline. And I can't let that happen. I have, done everything I can to keep it locked away." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. How could someone do something so terrible, and it was all in the name of self-preservation? But the spirit, the child, it deserves to be free. The owner's eyes softened, but there was a sadness in them. I know, he whispered, but I have been keeping it bound for so long, I don't know if it can ever be released without causing a terrible cost. Now I had heard enough. The curse was real and it was tied to the owner's family, but I couldn't just let the child's spirit suffer any longer. Something had to be done. The question was, what? That night, everything changed, because the moment I stepped into the townhouse, I felt it. A sense of dread and a coldness that seemed to seep into the walls. It was as if the house itself was alive and reacting to something, or someone. Then it started. The sound of doors slamming echoed through the house. I jumped and my heart was racing. Then I ran through the hallway, but it was like the house was alive. Each room felt more oppressive than the last. The windows rattled violently as if something was trying to break through. Suddenly I saw it. A figure in the doorway. A shadow, tall and thin, disappeared before I could even scream. But there were others. Apparitions faded in and out, moving through the rooms as if they were trapped in their own nightmare. Then I ran to the parlor, where the owner had been earlier. But the room was empty now. Only the faint sound of whispers filled the air. I felt like I was being surrounded, as if the spirits were watching me and waiting for something. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of crying. A child's cry, soft and sorrowful, coming from the walls, and it made my blood run cold. And then it hit me. But the spirits weren't after me. They were after the owner. The owner who had been trapped them, and they wanted him. I couldn't help but feel sorry for the owner, but at the same time, I knew he had to face the consequences of his actions. Now the house felt like it was about to explode. The lights flickered, and the air was thick with tension. The spirits were no longer whispering. They were screaming, and the walls shook, and the floor groaned beneath my feet. For a moment I realized I had to act quickly. The question was, what could I do? How could I help them? And more importantly, could I save the owner from the wrath of the spirits he had trapped for so long? The next day, I met with the paranormal investigator once more. I had no idea what to do. The house felt like it was on the edge of collapsing, and the spirits were growing more violent with each passing hour. Then the investigator said he had a plan, but it wasn't a simple one. He told me that there was a ritual, a way to release the spirits from their torment. But it was a dangerous ritual because one would require a lot of power. But there was a risk. If the ritual went wrong, the spirits would be unleashed with full force, and there would be no stopping them. So there is a chance, he said, and his voice was serious. The spirits might turn on everyone in the house. If we free them, there is no telling what will happen. But it is the only way to put an end to their suffering. I stood there and frozen for a moment. Could I really risk everything? The owner's plea for mercy echoed in my mind. But at what cost? How much longer could the child's spirit, along with all the others, suffer? But I knew what I had to do because the spirits had been trapped for too long. The child's spirit needed to be freed. And maybe, just maybe, the owner could be forgiven if he was willing to face the truth and help end the curse once and for all. Then, I turned to the investigator with determination in my eyes. We have to do it, and the spirits deserve to be free. And with that decision, I stepped into the basement ritual chamber. The final moment had arrived. The ritual would begin. But I wasn't sure if I was ready for the storm that would come next. Now the ritual was set. I stood in the dimly lit basement, and the air was thick with tension. The investigator had begun chanting, and his words were ancient and heavy. I could feel the energy building, and it was a pressure in the room that made it hard to breathe. I held my breath and gripped the small candle in my hand. It was now or never. Around me, the house seemed to pulse. The walls groaned and creaked like they were alive and aware of what was happening. The spirits were restless, and their presence was undeniable because could almost hear their whispers, calling out from every corner and urging me to finish what we had started. Then, I looked around and my eyes were darting to the broken floorboards. and the shadows that moved just beyond the candlelight. For a moment, I hesitated. If I completed this ritual, the house would be destroyed, but the spirits needed to be freed, and the truth had to come to light, so I had no choice. Suddenly, the ground shook beneath me. It was like the house was alive and it was fighting against the release of the spirits. The walls rattled, and the air grew colder. I felt a chill on my skin as I focused on the ritual and prayed that it would work. Then, the investigator's voice grew louder, and the room seemed to spin. Then, without warning, a violent tremor shook the house. The light flickered and the walls cracked. I could feel the house collapsing around me, and the foundation was breaking apart as the spirits were released. I stumbled back, and my heart was racing, because the house was crumbling. The ritual had worked, but it was too much for the building to handle. The walls buckled and the roof was caving in. Dust filled the air, and the ground beneath me trembled. I could hear the sound of something heavy falling, followed by the sound of splintering wood. The house was no longer standing. It was falling apart piece by piece. Then, we ran out into the streets of Boston, and the noise of destruction was echoing behind me. We didn't stop and we didn't look back. The spirits were free, but the townhouse had paid the price. I walked quickly, and my feet were moving faster than my thoughts. My mind was a blur of emotions. As I turned the corner, I looked back one last time. The ruins of the townhouse stood behind me. But something in the air still felt wrong because I didn't see the owner. Has he been trapped inside the ruins of the townhouse, or has he escaped too? Suddenly, the wind whispered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move in the distance. Had we truly freed the spirits? Or had we unleashed something worse? I shook my head and kept walking. The truth had been uncovered, but at what cost? I will never forget this experience because it changed me. And as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows would always be there and they were lingering in the ruins. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks.